Appiah considers four issues that he predicts future generations will find morally abhorrent, or at least morally flawed on our part. I am not going to analyze each of these, since the article is both brief and clear on them, but also I want to focus on what we can take away from this short article, namely some tools to measure the future moral status of contemporary practices. I'll take the time here to comment on two of the four cases Appiah discusses, and I'll offer brief comments on the other two cases. The second example Appiah examines in his article is our modern meat industry, sometimes referred to as factory farming, sometimes as the meat industrial complex, and sometimes, as Appiah refers to it, industrial meat production. While Appiah does critique this practice in terms of treatment of animals, it's important to notice this is not about eating animals per se. It is about the specific practice of widespread factory farming and how this practice leads to a certain way of treating animals that, for some future generation, will very likely be morally condemnable. In other words, the modern moral problem is specifically raising and butchering animals in this industrial factory setting. Now, there are other terms or values from which we could criticize the practice of producing meat on an industrial level. For example, and perhaps the most well known, is the argument for the value of non-human life, that we should not kill animals for consumption because we are not more deserving of life than non-human animals. And there is the economic argument that the meat industry as it is does not adequately pay for itself, nor the human labor involved, evidenced by subsidies for both meat industry and related agricultural industries, as well as this diminishing quality of meatpacking jobs. And then there is the environmental argument that the current meat industry uses natural resources like water, land, and other crops at unsustainable levels, and the results of cramming animals, cows in particular, together, hundreds at a time means their waste is toxic to the air and surrounding environment instead of fertilizing the soil. But like I said, Appiah does not take up those arguments. He is interested in how we treat the animals in our care, even if we're raising them to one day be eaten. The signs that future generations will condemn us for it are as follows. First, moral arguments against this kind of blind and callous treatment of animals have been around for a while. At least since the 18th century or 1700s, ethicists, activists, and scholars began to shift the focus of how we think about animals. For example, Jeremy Bentham, who was a utilitarian like John Stuart Mill, posed that, quote, the key question is not whether animals can reason, but whether they can suffer, end quote. Since this position came on the scene, we have gradually moved away from thinking that animals don't deserve consideration of how we treat them. And in the last century, we've seen this attitude develop into a cultural standard when it comes to our pets and pack animals and our need to test medicines and other chemical products. We are very much still reckoning with the treatment of animals we eat. As for sign 2, Appiah doesn't specify the existing non-moral arguments in his account, but we can consider counter-arguments that refer to, for example, nutrition or jobs. Arguments from nutrition, that we need or are better off nutritionally when we eat animals, fail to address the actual issue, namely how we treat the animals we're eating. And arguments referring to jobs don't stand up to the reality of time, that jobs go obsolete sometimes. Cultural values and standards are only one reason they might. More often, it's due to technology or new knowledge that transforms how we approach a kind of work, or simply outsourcing to other countries where companies don't have to pay as much per worker. As for sign 3, it is very common for people to be actually ignorant of what happens to their meat before they buy it, until they're teenagers or older. And most of us, when we learn about factory farming, we don't change our eating habits. There are a couple of reasons this happens. Some of us may not care. But also, it's generally difficult to change our habits, and food in particular is involved in all aspects of our lives. We eat everywhere we go, and we have to eat all the time. Obviously, we don't eat constantly, but you have to decide what to eat every day, multiple times a day. So changing a behavior that is so pervasive will be harder than changing a behavior you only do once a day, like trying to go to bed earlier, or behavior you only do once a week, like cleaning your room. The difficulty of changing eating habits, especially around meat, results in a strategic ignorance. While the vast majority of the meat we eat results from practices that cause immense harm to those animals, we do not reckon with that fact when we eat this kind of meat. In Appiah's words, we, quote, try not to think about it too much, shying away from stomach-turning stories about what happens in our industrial slaughterhouses, end quote. So what's at stake? In Appiah's words, quote, of the more than 90 million cattle in our country, at least 10 million at any time, are packed into feedlots, saved from the inevitable disease of overcrowding only by regular doses of antibiotics, surrounded by piles of their own feces, their nostrils filled with the smell of their own urine. He goes on to say, picture it, and then imagine your grandchildren seeing that picture, end quote. We should take stock, then, of the physical and psychological health of the animals we keep. Many animal cruelty laws exist, but when it comes to the meat industry, companies are basically exempt. Those laws only really apply to pets, chemical testing, and animals that are in some sort of service job. On our practices of elder care in the U.S., Appiah states simply, quote, when we see old people who, despite many living relatives, suffer growing isolation, we know something is wrong, end quote. He breaks this down according to his 3 signs, right? So first, moral arguments against this practice of isolating the elderly in order to care for them, they exist and they have existed. In his words, quote, we know the problems and their moral relevance, end quote. Isolated from loved ones and subject to administrative callousness when run for profit, we see many cases where the elderly are not cared for where they live and are separated from their friends and family. This kind of care is often callous, and being separated from friends and family does real harm. As far as sign 2, counter-arguments, moral or otherwise, barely exist. We, culturally and collectively, scarcely try to defend the situation of institutionalizing and isolating our older generations. But many of us just can't imagine how to solve this problem. So, when counter-arguments exist, they tend to be in the form of, how else shall we do it? And as for sign 3, strategic ignorance is rampant on this issue. The nature of this form of elder care is very much in the sort of out of sight, out of mind model. Thus, it is very easy for most of us to ignore its moral impact. Often, we put it out of our minds and don't reflect upon what it is like to live out one's life in such an isolated and administrative setting. On this issue, Appiah says, self-interest, if nothing else, should make us hope that our descendants will have worked out a better way. This is a good reminder that self-interest can be and often is connected to questions of what's good for all. I also want to make a comment on the fact that most people can't take care of their aging parents only because they have to work. And this reflects another issue intimately connected with elder care. Individuals in the US simply work a lot, and the flexibility to reduce hours is nearly zero for those who, in fact, want to care for their own elderly. And this reality feeds into why it's hard for us to imagine how it could be different. Because many families really don't feel like they have a choice. The issues of our prison system and the environment offer interesting extremes, at least in my mind. Allow me to explain. Concern for the environment is an issue that we are virtually all on the same page, globally. It is now a minority of people who deny that there is an issue at all, and a minority of people who refuse to accept the scale back in industrial production that correcting this issue requires. Like many large-scale, morally problematic practices, money and political power hold sway over the large-scale change that is required to change our behavior collectively. Meaning that, for most of us, the only thing we can really do that stands a change a chance, at actually amending our climate trajectory is participate in applying pressure to companies and policymakers, or our elected officials, to use their actual direct power to change our course. Our prison system, on the other hand, is arguably the most difficult for folks to accept as a massive moral failing. Right, so this is in contrast to how the environment is on large scale accepted as an issue that needs to be resolved and having very real moral and political consequences if left unresolved. But the prison system is something that a lot of folks fail to think is a moral problem right now. And I think that this is because of the unreflective way that we dehumanize criminals, no matter their offense. Many of us hold the unreflective assumption that if you are in prison, you deserve to be there. We then slide easily into thinking and saying that you deserve what happens to you once you are there. And if we assume everyone in prison deserves to be there, and thus also deserves whatever happens to them while in prison, we allow the whole phenomenon to slide right out of our minds. However, some facts must be reckoned with if we are going to have an honest conversation about the moral status and moral implications of the U.S. prison industry. Innocent people end up in prison. Wrongful convictions happen for all kinds of reasons and are tremendously difficult to overturn. The majority of people incarcerated these days are nonviolent. The war on drugs put millions of people, especially young men of color, behind bars for acts that are now legal in many places and seen as not morally wrong in many more. Many folks in county jails are locked up simply because they cannot make bail, meaning they are in prison before they are even convicted of any wrongdoing. And last, the punishment when someone is found guilty in court doesn't begin to represent all of what happens to someone in prison. Physical, psychological, and sexual abuse is rampant in prisons in the US. And this abuse happens at the hands of both other people in prison as well as prison administration via both guards and formal rules. For example, in order to keep an individual safe from physical harm, they very likely may end up in solitary confinement, which we know causes severe psychological harm. And so we have to ask, are we okay giving someone a sentence that includes such abuse? Because this is what happens when we send someone to prison in the US.